Good morning. We're up here doing our own form of monitoring and evaluation of how we're going to best keep on time and let one another know that. I'm very excited to be here this morning and to be in day 2 of an incredible meeting of identifying the role of violence and its prevention in the post-2015 global agenda. I have the honor of facilitating or moderating a panel on exploration of monitoring and evaluation. This panel, according to our agenda goal, the panel is designed to explore the ways in which we might monitor and evaluate the successes made over the coming years in relation to the post-2015 global agenda. And I'd like to introduce our 2 presenters, and then we'll take it from there. To my far left, we have Thomas Apt. He's a senior a senior research fellow for the Innovation and Citizen Security Project with the Growth Lab at the Center for International Development at Harvard University and Harvard Kennedy School. And their longer bios are in your book, so please do check those out. To my immediate left is Aubrey Fox, Executive Director of the United States Office of the Institute for Economics and Peace, a nonprofit think tank. And I was looking at my own hieroglyphics from yesterday as well, and I'm thinking that what we're going to be talking about today is how can we, how must we use monitoring and evaluation in our own efforts to move the SDGs forward. And that yesterday and today, I'm sure we'll talk about what I call or frame shared social determinants, that there are cross-cutting issues across all the SDGs that affect the communities in which people live and work, and that what can we learn from evaluation indicators? What I'm interested in knowing is what could I learn from evaluation indicators that I might transfer for use with my own program or my own particular interests or the SDGs that I am working on with my program. And then through monitoring and evaluation, how can we expand perhaps our networks? How can we develop new collaborations as we meet others that are really looking at a certain section or sections of the SDGs, and we realize that there's really a connection to the work we're doing, and how can we learn from others? So with that, I'm just going to ask Aubrey to dive in and take it away.
Thanks, Evelyn, and thanks to the National Academies for inviting me here. I said that I grew up in Washington, but I'd never actually set foot in this building, and that I already feel 10% smarter just being inside here. So as Evelyn said, I'm Aubrey Fox. I'm the executive director of a think tank called the Institute for Economics and Peace. And the subject of my talk today is really about measurement. I mean, there's a lot of debate and very good debate about whether the Sustainable Development Goal framework is the right framework, whether there's too many goals, whether it's too broad. And I do have some comments on that, but I want to leave that aside for the moment for the purposes of my presentation, because what I want to talk about is, regardless of what you think of the framework, how can we come to understand whether or not we're making progress against the goals or not? How do we create a system, whether it's a system that's done from within the UN system or from outside it, that can help us bring some more transparency and accountability to the SDGs as they unfold? And I think we're a good organization to think about those questions, because basically that's what we do. I mean, we're data gatherers. We measure a very broad issue, which is the state of peace in the world, using a number of different indicators, and we try to bring together a lot of information into one place. And I think we'll all agree that if the goal is to bring some transparency and accountability to the Sustainable Development Goals, you need to be able to engage in a very big picture kind of analysis. And so how do you do that? How do you get your arms around a topic as large as that? So my first goal will be getting my arms around the clicker. But you know, I'll just keep going until we figure out the technical issues. So who are we? We're a global think tank, and we're dedicated to building a greater understanding of the key drivers and measures of peace, and to identifying the economic benefits that increased peacefulness can deliver. Now, some of you may know our signature research product, which is something called the Global Peace Index. It comes out every June, This is the 9th edition that I'm holding that came out in 2015. We're about to release the 10th edition of the Global Peace Index this June. In fact, we have a big event coming up at the Reagan Building on June 15th to mark the 10th anniversary. And so we have developed some expertise. We have been doing this for now 10 years. We've been assembling a great deal of data. And so I think we are in a position to make some statements about what it would take to bring this kind of perspective to the study of the Sustainable Development Goals. So just to give you a little context about the Global Peace Index, I mentioned it ranks 162 countries on their peacefulness. So we're able to provide a kind of global understanding of whether the world is becoming more or less peaceful, but then for 162 countries, we're able to show how they rank against one another. Now, ranking isn't our only goal, but I will say as a parenthetical aside, it drives a lot of media attention. I think we know that. Whether it's college rankings or hospitals, the media love rankings, and so it's one of the things that's driven a tremendous amount of attention that's been brought to our Global Peace Index, which we think is a good thing. We use 23 indicators in our analysis, and I'll get into that a little bit later, but the idea essentially is that if you're asking a question as big as, is the world getting more or less peaceful, it kind of works like a jigsaw puzzle. You have to pull in a lot of information from a variety of domains in order to understand the answer to that question. And so we, like other index creators, use a strategy which is known as a composite index. So that's what we construct. We create an index out of data pulled from many different sources, and we add some original data collection of our own. Now, we don't do this work by ourselves. We work with a panel of international experts. They help us with how we originally define peace. They help us choose the indicators we use and refine them over time. And they help us assign scores to each of the indicators. And each of these 23 indicators are scored on a 1 to 5 scale. 1 is good and 5 is bad. We also have worked historically and continue to work with the Economist Intelligence Unit. They employ in-country experts all around the world. And in some instances where data does not exist for a particular country and a particular indicator, we rely on their expertise to help fill those gaps. Okay, so I don't think I need to convince you that a Global Peace Index is a useful exercise, but just to talk a minute about why we do it. So one of the things that is foundational to our institution is this notion that we know very little, in fact, about basic facts of whether countries are peaceful or not. And more importantly, we know very little about what factors drive peaceful environments. So when we talk about violence prevention, I think it's fair to say that we're often talking about diagnosing the dynamics of conflict and chaos. And that requires a particular kind of lens and a particular kind of understanding, clearly very important. But understanding what causes peace actually requires a very different set of skills. And it requires a different kind of analysis. And what we're trying to do is simultaneously understand, and to get into some technical terms we use, negative peace, which we define as the absence of violence or fear of violence, but also positive peace, which we define as the factors of more peaceful societies. And in fact, being able to divide the analysis that way and run that analysis in parallel is very provocative and interesting, because it allows you to establish as a snapshot where a given country or society stands today, but also what its potential to become more or less peaceful in the future is. And there's all sorts of interesting insights that get thrown off by that ability to do that parallel kind of analysis. So we've also found that the Global Peace Index is a very powerful tool that people can use in different ways. We work closely with the UN, the OECD. We also do some separate analysis in individual countries, including Mexico, which has been very powerful in that context. And I guess the final point we'll make is that because we rely on data to do our analysis, we are, by virtue of that, data advocates. we're able to say, like, here's where the data is good, here's where the data is really poor, and here's what we need to do to close that gap. And so I think that's going to be critical as we go through this SDG debate. So why do we consider peace to be particularly important today? I think many of you may be familiar with the argument that if you look at thousands of years of human history, the world is significantly more peaceful. That is no doubt true. And since World War II, peace has improved on the whole, but in the last 10 years since we have started collecting data, we have found actually a small but significant decline in peace. So clearly something that the world needs to care about and pay attention, and shouldn't assume that we will always be going in a continuously upward and positive direction. It isn't hard to find things to be worried about. We all know that we have an enormous refugee and internally displaced people problem. Terrorism is accelerating rapidly. Thomas will speak to some of this persistent interpersonal violence in Latin America and domestic violence around the world. So as a peace institution, we don't define peace as the opposite of war. We define it as the opposite of violence and conflict. So we have a much more expansive definition of what we mean by peace. And then the final point to make, which is directly relevant to the SDG debate, is that we know from the last go-around, from the Millennium Development Goals, that countries that are embroiled in conflict just can't meet any of their development goals. I mean, it's just a fact. And so, that by, metaphorically speaking, by brute force, that insight has found its way into the UN system and the Sustainable Development Goal process. So just very briefly to talk about the work that we do in the methodology of the Global Peace Index. I mentioned that we use a composite index. So we're gathering information from a lot of different data sources. Indexes are very popular now. Organizations use them as an advocacy tool. They use them as a way of kind of staking out a piece of intellectual territory. And I've always found it interesting that the way indexes are treated, there's almost a kind of schizophrenic reaction. The media tend to accept them totally uncritically, as if the findings come down on high and cannot be challenged in any way. Academics, and I'm making a broad generalization, often hate them because they don't meet the kind of rigor that they would like to use in their own analyses. And you can see why, because they essentially gather together data from different sources and gathered in different ways into one mega score, so to speak. So we try to follow a set of principles that allow us to get the best of this approach, and you can see them here. But the one thing to point out is that we're very transparent about what we do. So you can look through our materials and see exactly how we collect the data, what indicators we use, how we weigh them, et cetera, et cetera. There are a lot of pros and cons to this approach. I mean, I think the biggest one in my mind is that you can take an issue as complicated as peace and you can boil it down in ways that are simple to understand and provocative. And I think actually there's a real value to that beyond the value of beyond its PR appeal, which is that we do live in a complicated world, and more than anything, I think we need people who can make intelligent judgments and can present information in a compelling way that cuts through the clutter. I mentioned some of the cons that people have raised against indexes, which I think are legitimate. So yes, we do this through a three-part process, in part to preserve the independence of the index. We create a principled data collection process, and then we gather the data and report on the conclusions, not the reverse. And I mentioned earlier that we define peace in these two very different ways. Okay, so what are some of our indicators? I'm not going to go through this exhaustively. Again, you can look through our index and review them yourself, but we essentially include measures of ongoing domestic and international conflict, societal safety and security, and militarization. Another way we divide this is we look at both internal peace indicators, so indicators that are internal to a particular country. So interpersonal violence would be an internal indicator. We also look at external indicators, indicators that involve relationships between two nations. This is the list of our indicators. No way you can read all of this, but again, just to give you a sense of the scope of our analysis. We rely on a number of outside organizations who provide us with the data. And we have either created or refined 6 of the 23 indicators. And the one that I like to point out, because it's one of the ones that I find the most interesting, is we have an indicator around the impact of terrorism. And in the early days of the Global Peace Index, we relied completely on the Economist Intelligence Unit to tell us how serious terrorism was in a particular country. Why did we do that? Terrorism is, as you might understand, very poorly, if at all, collected by nation states. There's no official data that you can rely on. There is, however, a very interesting institution at the University of Maryland called the START Center, which has compiled something called the Global Terrorism Database, which essentially through very sophisticated social media search processes and a lot of staff time, they collect data about each discrete terrorist incident in the world. And their data collection process has only improved over time. They look exhaustively at the description that they can find, and they code it according to certain principles. And as a result, they have gathered a tremendous amount of information about terrorism, which we take and marry to our global broader data set to incorporate both in the Global Peace Index and in a totally separate Global Terrorism Index, which we produce every year as well and will come out in November. And as terrorism has become such a bigger issue, has really captured people's attention. So just a highlight of a few findings. I mentioned earlier that there have been deteriorations in peace over the 10-year period. Interestingly enough, a lot of that has to do with safety and security, so internal peace indicators. And we found, strikingly, that there's a very strong division between the most peaceful nations in the world becoming more and more peaceful and the least peaceful nations in the world becoming less and less peaceful. So we would call that growing inequality in peace. The nature of everyday violence is changing. I think that's an important point to make, such that war is still a problem, war between nations, but it is declining as a problem in our index. And internal peace indicators, most importantly, interpersonal violence is growing. I mentioned terrorism as a growing problem. I mean, these are really startling numbers, and a 7-fold increase in deaths from terrorism from 2002, and that red line is going higher. So this somewhat complicated looking chart makes this point about global peace inequality. What it basically says is that the gap between the most and least peaceful countries in the world is growing at a very startling rate. Another point that might be of interest to Thomas and others is if you're looking at a mega trend to be concerned about, we're very concerned about this idea of what the impact of growing urbanization will have on peace levels. So this is a very complicated topic, and there's a lot of different camps. Broadly speaking, urbanization has tended to be associated with greater peace because it is also associated with greater economic development. And at the 50,000 feet level, that is true. However, it does turn out that if you look at where growth is going to happen in urban populations, most of it will occur in countries that are already at low levels of peace. And so there's a huge challenge of trying to make the best of what urbanization has to offer while dealing with the fact that we're going to be, our population, global population is going to grow rapidly in countries that are already struggling to deal with these issues. We do some work on the global cost of violence. And the idea here is to understand that, if violence were an industry, how much does it cost us? There's a lot now of analysis and accountability around what does the healthcare system cost? What does the education system cost? Are we getting what we want from these investments? But people don't think of violence as an industry, even though it is hugely costly. And this is a conservative estimate of $14 trillion, or 13.4% of world GDP. But you can imagine the opportunity cost that's lost through this enormous expenditure of dollars. And the one thing I'll point out is that we do this analysis by country level too. And if you look at what countries spend the most on violence as a percentage of their GDP, then the analysis gets really shocking because you have a lot of extremely poor countries that are spending 20 or 30% of their GDP on violence. And so it's not just a raw number that matters, it's the percentage of a country's wealth that we're concerned about. So I mentioned earlier that we study positive peace as well as negative peace. We define that as the attitudes, institutions, and structures of more peaceful societies. And it is an attempt to reframe the study of peace to what works. And so we've come up with 8 factors that we think are important. And we see this as a system, so they're mutually reinforcing. And I think the important thing is, as our analysis progresses, we're able to show that in particular contexts, particular factors are more or less important as leading indicators. Although we don't want to isolate any one particular factor because, again, this is a system we're trying to describe. And another way of defining this is what the optimal environment for peace to flourish. I'll skip some of this. So one of the things that's really interesting is that if you look at positive peace, there's actually been some gradual improvement globally in positive peace rankings and ratings. But negative peace has declined slightly. So there's a little bit of a conundrum there. And I think we all know that there's been some basic positive developments in reductions in poverty and reductions of other social indicators. And so I think it's important to say that there may be a time lag between improvement in positive peace and improvement in negative peace. There's a complicated theory of change that underlies how improvements of positive peace translate into improvements in negative peace. But broadly speaking, as positive peace improves, you should see improvements in negative peace. Another point that we make is around nonviolence being actually empirically analyzed as a more effective kind of form of resistance than violence. That's a very interesting development in the social sciences. It's not just a moral positive to engage in nonviolence. It actually is, you're more likely to accomplish your goals if you operate nonviolently. And we found that countries with high levels of positive peace tend to have a greater proportion of resistance movements that are expressed nonviolently. So I'm going to skip to this final slide to try to sum up why I think our research approach matters to the SDGs. And I think, again, there are several reasons why we should be concerned about relying on the formal way in which the UN system is planning to gather data about the SDGs at the moment. So essentially, the formal approach the UN will use is to rely on country statistical offices to produce reports tracking the SDGs that will be added up and measured on a global scale. Well, we know that that has some real limitations, and this points out some of them. I'd point out the political issues. A lot of countries are very sensitive about particular SDGs, some of the methodological issues. And so our goal as an institution is to create an independent measure of the Sustainable Development Goals. It's something we're going to be writing about in a preliminary way in this year's Global Peace Index, but we also plan to create an independent measure. And one question that I want to leave you with is, I know people have spoken about this, is it too big? How do you target question related to the implementation of the SDGs. We have a similar technical conundrum which we're facing, which is that within the United Nations system, there's actually a growing resistance to focusing on Goal 16 alone as the only mechanism for achieving peace. And so for us, as an agency trying to drive transparency and accountability, that means, technically speaking, we will be pushed to include other indicators in our analysis. But as we all know, it's already an overwhelming task to get, even Goal 16 alone covers so much territory that it's incredibly difficult to sum up accurately. But to then be asked to add additional data in the analysis is a real challenge. So how do we balance on the technical side, leaving aside the policy implications, this desire to go big versus this desire to take a closer look. So I leave you with our website, visionofhumanity.org. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I have 100 questions, but they'll have to wait.